The man known to history as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in the town of Hyde Park, New York, on the 30th of January 1882. His father, James Roosevelt, was a Harvard graduate and a successful businessman who had interests and investments in various coal and transport companies and also had connections with the Democratic Party, serving as the minister's secretary at the American Embassy to Great Britain in the 1850s under the then ambassador and eventual 15th President of the United States, James Buchanan. Franklin's mother, Sarah Ann Delano, whose ancestors came to America on the Mayflower all the way back in 1620, had married James in 1880 and was a driven and intelligent woman. Her father Warren had once operated an opium business in British Hong Kong, where she lived for 3 years, and at one stage Sarah also attended a girls' school in the German city of Dresden. As such, it was a well-traveled and liberal family background which Franklin was born into. In the modern world, Sarah would have undoubtedly had a successful career of her own, but she was forced by the social constraints of the time to be a homemaker, which perhaps inevitably caused her to place much of her hopes for the future on Franklin, as he was her only child. Franklin himself was an active child, who also proved to be intelligent and gifted at almost anything he undertook, and he soon became adept at the sporting activities of his class, such as horse riding, shooting, tennis, golf, and polo. Instead of allowing the family's servants to educate Franklin, as was the convention of the time, Sarah chose to educate her son herself during his early years, until he was eventually sent to the Groton boarding school in Massachusetts. The headmaster of this school, Endicott Peabody, would prove to be an important guiding influence on Franklin over the coming years, teaching him the importance of Christian charity, and he would later go on to officiate at Roosevelt's wedding in 1905. In 1900, Franklin's father, James Roosevelt, died, which was a devastating blow for 18-year-old Franklin. Despite this, his prospects improved a year later when his cousin Theodore Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. His commanding and energetic leadership soon made him Franklin's new role model. It was around this time that Franklin enrolled at Harvard College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he failed to shine academically. He stated later that he studied economics for 4 years and everything he had been taught was incorrect. He did distinguish himself, though, as editor of the Harvard Crimson, the daily newspaper published by Harvard students since 1873. Despite him not enjoying his time at Harvard, Franklin graduated regardless in 1903 with an A.B. in history, and then, after dropping out of law school in 1908, joined the Wall Street firm of Carter, Ledyard and Milburn, working in the company's Admiralty Law Division. While working here, he was known to tell his co-workers that he intended to become the President of the United States one day, just like his cousin Theodore. In 1902, Franklin began to court his distant cousin Eleanor, whom he had known since childhood, and after spending several years reaffirming their ties by means of family meetings and correspondence, Franklin successfully proposed in 1904. Eleanor herself was the youngest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt's brother Elliot, whose branch of the Roosevelt family had split from Franklin's in the 17th century in the shape of Nicholas Roosevelt, who was Franklin's 4th great-grandfather and Eleanor's 5th great-grandfather. The couple were married on the 17th of March 1905, despite fierce opposition from Franklin's mother, Sarah, who thought her son was too young to marry. At the ceremony, Eleanor's uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt, gave her away, as her father Elliot had died in 1894. Both Franklin and Eleanor then moved to the Roosevelt family estate at Springwood in Hyde Park, where Eleanor had to endure the difficulty of living next door to her mother-in-law. The couple went on to parent 6 children together, one of whom, Franklin Jr., died in infancy in 1909. Despite giving birth to 6 children, Eleanor found married life to be difficult in many respects, and at one point stated that she found intercourse to be an ordeal that had to be endured. This lack of natural intimacy would later result in Franklin having numerous affairs, and Eleanor herself would also go on to form close and possibly intimate friendships with a number of women. Perhaps the most notorious of Franklin's extramarital relationships was with his wife's secretary Lucy Mercer, which began in or around 1916, and which Eleanor discovered when she found letters between the two by accident. This nearly ended their marriage, and it was only after Franklin's mother stepped in and told him that if he divorced Eleanor, she would disinherit him, that their union was spared. Despite this tumult, both Franklin and Eleanor would remain married until his death in 1945. But, perhaps as a consequence of his extramarital liaisons, it remained a union based on mutual respect or duty rather than love or passion. However, regardless, Eleanor made Franklin promise that he would never see Lucy again, which was an oath that he eventually failed to keep. In 1910, Franklin joined the local Democratic Party, which was eager to recruit him due to his family name. After being accepted and nominated, Roosevelt campaigned for a seat on New York State Assembly. After leading an energetic campaign, in which he traveled around the local area by car, Franklin won. This surprised many, as New York politics was largely dominated by the Republicans in the early 20th century. It's worth remembering in assessing Franklin's career that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the political map of the United States was very different to what it is today. The Republican Party were a significant force in many of the northern states, while the Democrats were actually the party of choice of the southern states, the direct opposite of how it is today. Thus, Roosevelt's capturing of a seat in New York for the Democrats on his first effort was a surprise to many. He then assumed his new responsibilities on the 1st of January 1911. Roosevelt quickly gained a reputation as something of a radical within the local Democratic Party, leading a group of so-called insurgents who were opposed to Tammany Hall, a political organization in New York City that had controlled nominations and dictated policy there since the mid-19th century, and had a reputation for corruption and looking after the interests of the rich above the working classes and the poor. Because of his opposition to Tammany Hall, Franklin soon became a popular figure with many New York Democrats, and in 1911, the Democrat nominations caused controversy within his family when he backed Woodrow Wilson and not his cousin Theodore Roosevelt's campaign for the presidency of the United States. Theodore had left the Republicans after failing to secure the party's nomination to campaign during the forthcoming election, which caused divisions within the party. He subsequently ran as an independent candidate for a newly created and short-lived progressive party called the Bull Moose Party. Despite him failing to secure his cousin's backing, Theodore was not angered by Franklin's support for Woodrow Wilson, as he was, after all, a member of the Democratic Party, which he would have been forced to resign from in order to support him, and it could be said that this was, in hindsight, the correct decision, as Theodore not only lost the election, but his progressives fell into obscurity over the coming years. Franklin's decision to back Woodrow Wilson was vindicated when he won the presidential election of 1912, becoming the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland, who left office in 1897. This election victory was a landslide for the Democrats, who won nearly 42% of the popular vote, and Roosevelt was then rewarded for his support of Wilson, when the new president appointed him to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, deputizing under Josephus Daniels. Shortly after this appointment, Franklin resigned from his seat on New York's State Assembly in order to concentrate on his career in Washington, D.C., as he was seen by many to have a promising future ahead of him due to his intelligence, work ethic, and family name. During their time in the department, both Roosevelt and Daniels oversaw the introduction of a new merit-based system of promotion within the United States Navy, as well as extending civilian control over various aspects of naval administration, in which Franklin oversaw relations between the government and the members of the Navy's civilian workforce. This position would give Franklin a great amount of experience in dealing with labor issues, as well as industrial disputes, and also in naval administration during wartime, that would both prove to be invaluable to him during the later Great Depression, as well as the Second World War, and it was this period as Assistant Secretary that forged his affiliation and love for the American Navy that would endure for the rest of his days. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, a conflict which eventually turned into the First World War, and there was a strong consensus of opinion that the United States should begin to rearm in case it was forced to join the conflict. As a result, President Wilson gave the go-ahead for an expansion of the Navy. That was accelerated after the sinking of various civilian vessels, including the RMS Lusitania in 1915. Because of this, the United States Navy was more than doubled in size by the end of the First World War, which ended after America joined the Entente led by Britain and France against the Central Powers of Germany and the Empire of Austria-Hungary. This greatly hastened the ultimate surrender of the Central Powers in the Armistice of 1918. After the conflict, the US Navy was scaled back to peacetime numbers. In the aftermath of the First World War, President Wilson attempted to ensure lasting peace throughout the globe by establishing the League of Nations, which was first proposed and included as part of the Treaty of Versailles that was signed on the 28th of June 1919, creating the first international covenant designed primarily to maintain world peace. However, the creation of the League of Nations greatly weakened Wilson's position as president in the eyes of many Americans, particularly those of a Republican persuasion, who feared their country's sovereignty could potentially be superseded by an international governing body, and who were also opposed to any American involvement in the affairs of foreign nations. This opposition then continued to gain momentum, until finally the Republican-dominated Senate rejected the president's plans for America to join the League of Nations. Wilson's position was further undermined by him suffering a massive stroke on the 2nd of October 1919 that left him bedridden for weeks, and his administration, much like himself, paralyzed. It is no exaggeration to say that Woodrow Wilson's policies, at least in regards to foreign affairs, provided a template for Franklin Roosevelt's own political ideas over the coming decades, as he would, after the Second World War, resurrect his mentor's plans for a League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations. As it was now becoming increasingly evident that President Wilson's tenure was coming to an end, Roosevelt and his allies reached out to Herbert Hoover about the possibility of him becoming the party's next candidate for the presidency in the 1920 presidential elections. Hoover had formerly been a member of President Wilson's administration, but had never been a member of either party. In the lead-up to the election in 1920, he calculated that the Democrats were unlikely to be victorious and declared himself as a Republican, yet he failed to secure that party's nomination for the presidency by losing to Warren G. Harding in the primaries. This in turn scuppered Franklin's plans to run as vice president under Hoover. But after James M. Cox was nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate instead, he chose Roosevelt as his running mate. Yet, despite both men embarking on a campaign across the country, they were defeated by a wide margin in the election by Harding, who became the 29th President of the United States on the 4th of March 1921. The return of the Republicans to power simultaneously heralded a return of America to isolationism, in which involvement in foreign affairs was kept to a minimum. This would last until finally the sleeping giant that was the United States of America was awoken from its slumber by the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the mid-1930s. Although his and Cox's loss in the 1920 election was a bitter pill to swallow, Roosevelt had gained valuable experience in campaigning on the national stage and was now a major figure within the Democratic Party. He was viewed by many within the party to be the great hope of the left wing within America going forward. However, Franklin's hopes and dreams would soon be almost completely dashed when, in August of 1921, he began to experience terrifying symptoms of paralysis from the waist down, combined with bladder and bowel dysfunction. The diagnosis for these ailments was grim to say the least, as Franklin had contracted poliomyelitis, otherwise known as polio, an infectious disease caused by the polio virus that is often transferred from person to person by infected fecal matter entering the mouth possibly via unwashed food or unclean water. There has since been speculation that Roosevelt's symptoms are more consistent with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is caused by the immune system attacking the peripheral nervous system, which is a relay between the brain and limbs. But whatever the cause of his illness, Franklin was now paralyzed from the waist down and would never walk or even stand unaided again. This illness would have ended the lives of many men, let alone their careers. However, Roosevelt evidently possessed great reserves of strength and determination, as he then set about trying to lead as normal a life as possible, to ultimately facilitate his return to mainstream politics. He did this by having the pedals of his car adapted so he could brake and accelerate by hand, and even had a pair of iron braces constructed to enable him to stand or walk with assistance, where he would use his waist to swivel each limb in turn, enabling him to move upright for short distances. Despite these innovations, Franklin would spend the majority of his waking hours sitting in one of his custom-built wheelchairs, meaning that he would often have to be carried up and down flights of stairs in buildings where no elevators were installed, and this soon prompted him to have a service lift adapted in his home in Hyde Park, which enabled him to travel between floors unaided. Over the coming years, Franklin would go to great lengths to ensure he was never publicly photographed in his wheelchair, and would, when giving speeches or appearing in public, often be seen to stand by using his steel leg braces along with the literal support of an aide or one of his children. For the time being at least, Roosevelt's illness meant that he had to withdraw from frontline politics for a time during the 1920s so that he could come to terms with his disability, both mentally and physically. It was during this time that Roosevelt visited Warm Springs in Georgia for the first time. Located in the west of the state, Warm Springs is home to mineral springs which flow nearly constantly at a temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. Beginning in the early 19th century, Georgians had begun spending time here in a belief that the warm thermal waters were good for recuperating from illnesses. It had become one of the most well-known thermal springs in the United States by the 1920s, and so in October 1924, Roosevelt set off for Georgia in the hope that he would be able to regain some of the strength in his legs by bathing and exercising in the water there. He would never meet with the success he desired in that respect, but Warm Springs nevertheless became central to his life. Over the years, he engaged in extensive charitable activity here, founding the Roosevelt Warm Springs Institute for Rehabilitation some years after his first visit, having heard numerous stories of people who had regained the use of their legs from hydrotherapy they received there. In the 1930s, the institute became the only center of its kind dedicated to treating patients with polio. Each Thanksgiving, Roosevelt would host an event here for the patients, and when he became president some years later, he constructed what he called the Little White House at Warm Springs. Such was the centrality of the place and the institute to his life by the 1930s. Despite his retreat from frontline politics in the early and mid-1920s, Roosevelt still maintained close connections with the top of the Democratic Party, for which he would eventually give presidential nomination speeches in 1924 and 1928. Although these speeches were outwardly a show of support for the Democratic nominees, they were in reality dress rehearsals for Franklin's own political resurrection, as he calculated that he could not hope to win any future Democratic nomination, let alone the presidency, without being seen to be able to stand. During both addresses, he wowed the crowds with his oratory, whilst gripping the podium with all his strength in a desperate effort to remain upright. This effort to appear mobile was in large part due to Franklin's fear that his disability would be used against him by his Republican rivals, whom he thought would claim his inability to walk would also impair his ability to govern. It is certainly remarkable that throughout his lifetime and his later presidency, the true nature of Roosevelt's disability would remain unknown to the vast majority of the American public, who thought him requiring assistance to walk was due to him being lame or arthritic. Despite Franklin's public support, the Democrats were defeated in the presidential elections by the Republicans in both 1924 and 1928, largely due to the fact that the economy was booming and also because the party was divided on various issues such as prohibition, which banned the production of alcohol from 1920 to 1933. Indeed, Roosevelt himself, like many men of his class, enjoyed drinking expensive cocktails, and along with chain smoking, this would become one of his guilty pleasures, ones which were unaffected by prohibition. In the lead-up to the 1928 election, Al Smith, who was the Democratic nominee for the presidency, was forced to step down as governor of New York, as he could not, by law, hold the position as well as the presidency, meaning that an election had to be held to appoint a new governor as a consequence. Smith, fearing a Republican landslide, then asked Roosevelt to run as the Democratic candidate for the governorship of New York, and after a hard-fought campaign, Franklin was eventually triumphant, winning by the slender margin of 1% of the vote, making him the head of government in America's most populous state and a frontrunner for the next Democratic presidential nomination in 1932. In contrast to this, the Democrats and Al Smith were crushed in the presidential election, losing heavily to Herbert Hoover, an election result which historians broadly view as being reflective of the widespread anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment which still prevailed in America during the first half of the 20th century, Smith being Roman Catholic and of both Irish and Italian ancestry. This election defeat effectively ended Smith's ambitions of claiming the top job, though he would later go on to become the president of Empire State Incorporated, which was the company responsible for the construction of the marvel of architecture and engineering, that is the Empire State Building in Manhattan. In the year following the election, on Tuesday the 29th of October 1929, the Wall Street crash sent the world's economy into turmoil, causing share prices on the New York Stock Exchange to collapse over the weeks that followed. This crash was primarily caused by a huge amount of speculative public investment being made in the US stock market during the late 1920s, in which millions of Americans invested their life savings into the stock market in the hope of making a fortune by buying shares in what they hoped were up-and-coming companies and/or commodities. To cash in on this boom of investment, many people even took out loans in order to buy more stocks and shares. And when no further loans could be obtained, they then bought stocks on an IOU basis in the hope that they would be able to pay at a later date, as and when they made a profit. Another factor was corruption and insider dealing, which was undertaken by men such as Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President John F. Kennedy, who during the 1920s sought to buy worthless stocks en masse, which made them appear to be a good speculative investment to the untrained eye. This mass buying inflated the price of these stocks and shares, which Kennedy and his like would then cash in on by selling them to inexperienced investors, such as the general public, who would, in the end, lose nearly all their money when the stock market crashed. Kennedy would go on to make millions during the later Great Depression itself, by buying up potentially valuable real estate and land at reduced prices, which he would then later sell when the market improved over the coming decades, which at least in part funded his family's rise to power in US politics. No one knows exactly what triggered the massive selling of stocks that initiated the Wall Street crash, but historians and economists have since speculated that a combination of rumor, hearsay, and the spread of panic caused a chain reaction of mass selling that flooded the market, and as a result caused stock prices to tumble and millions of dollars to be lost. It should also be noted that the Wall Street crash was not the sole cause of the following Great Depression, but it certainly did undermine the confidence of the American public in the country's financial institutions, particularly the banks, as well as the government and the Federal Reserve. Indeed, although many of America's smaller local banks were still solvent and soundly run, the larger banks had, during the market boom of the 1920s, invested their customers, investors, and depositors' money into the US stock market, meaning that when the crash came, the banks lost millions of dollars of their customers' money that they were then unable to give back due to lack of funds. This meant that the banks were soon forced to deny cash withdrawals to the American public, which caused a panic-driven chain reaction or bank run across America and then the wider world, as millions of people rushed to withdraw their non-existent savings. The lack of cash flow inevitably crippled consumer spending as well as lending, meaning that there was a mass shortage of capital within the American economy and, as a result, businesses laid off workers in their millions or closed altogether. As America was the largest economy in the world at that time, the contagion spread across the globe as international loans were recalled in the desperate search for money and private investment was slashed. The recall of these international loans inevitably damaged the economies of countries around the world who were still struggling to recover from the devastation of the First World War, particularly nations such as Germany and Japan, who then saw a rise in radical nationalistic political parties who would seize power over the coming decade and plunge mankind into another world war. This panic and lack of capital was then further compounded by President Herbert Hoover's administration itself, as it thought the crisis would be short-lived and therefore refused point-blank to stimulate the economy with quantitative easing, which would have involved the printing of money. This would have then enabled the banks to stay open and lending and investment to continue. The government then arguably made things worse by raising import tariffs on international trade, which did nothing but damage businesses across America and around the world, as it only restricted international transactions as well as the flow of goods. The Wall Street crash and the Great Depression which followed inevitably damaged Herbert Hoover's reputation, particularly concerning economic matters, and with the end of Hoover's first term fast approaching, Franklin Roosevelt stepped up his plans to run for the Democratic nomination for the presidential election in 1932. To help secure his future candidacy, Roosevelt first sought re-election as governor of New York by enacting and advocating various reforms to alleviate the crisis, such as setting up an employment commission, endorsing unemployment insurance and aid to farmers, as well as better pensions for the elderly. These policies clearly resonated with New York's population, as he then won the state election by a 14% margin over his Republican rival. This solidified Roosevelt's position as the front-runner for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. During the following months, he appointed his campaign team and ramped up his plans for the forthcoming Democratic National Convention in 1932, at which he clinched the party's nomination by defeating Al Smith, the party's defeated candidate in the 1928 election, who came a distant second to Roosevelt in the race to become the Democratic candidate. Roosevelt then, along with his running mate for the vice presidency, John Nance Garner, launched his presidential campaign, in which he pledged his support for America's workers by promising better regulation of the economy, stock market and banking system, along with the cutting of trade tariffs, financial help for farmers and investment in public works, in order to end the Great Depression. Franklin then went on to defeat Herbert Hoover by a massive landslide in the 1932 presidential election, by winning 57% of the popular vote and crucially securing control of both houses of Congress, meaning that he was able to pass legislation with greater ease without Republican interference. Roosevelt, though, nearly never made it to the Oval Office at all. On the 15th of February 1933, 17 days before he was due to be inaugurated as president, Giuseppe Zangara, a mentally ill Italian-American, came close to assassinating Roosevelt following a speech he had given in Miami. Zangara was a 32-year-old laborer who was born in southern Italy and who had come to the United States in the early 1920s. He had extensive health problems which resulted in chronic pain. These contributed to his deteriorating psychological state in the early 1930s. Why he attempted to kill the president-elect has never been fully resolved, but most believe that he was at least partially insane. During Roosevelt's speech at the Bayfront on the night of the 15th of February, Zangara, who was just 5 foot tall, stood on top of a folding chair to rise over the crowd and fired off numerous shots. All of them missed Roosevelt, but 5 bystanders were injured, including Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who had accompanied Roosevelt to Miami. Cermak later died in hospital. Zangara was put on trial and executed just 5 weeks later after being found guilty of first-degree murder. Conspiracy theories have abounded since, that Zangara was a hired hitman and that the target was actually Cermak, who was overseeing a fight to crack down on organized crime in Chicago. But the reality seems that Zangara's target was almost certainly Roosevelt, and he had no motive beyond a general disaffection towards society. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States on the 4th of March 1933, when he gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, stating, quote, "So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." This rallying cry was important, as the American economy had slumped to new lows in the final months of the Hoover administration, making the task that now faced Roosevelt an extremely difficult one, as 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed, and a further 2 million people were on the streets and in a state of near starvation. On top of this, food prices had fallen by nearly 60%, meaning that farmers were now facing ruin, and in addition, tens of thousands of banks were refusing cash withdrawals, which meant that businesses could not pay their employees and families could not buy food or goods. It is hard to fully appreciate the misery caused to the average American by the Great Depression. Even the difficult years following the financial crash of 2008 were mild by comparison. In order to address this and take action after the lethargy of Hoover's administration, Roosevelt now proposed a new program of mass public investment and government-created jobs to expand America's infrastructure and get people back to work and prosperity. 3 decades earlier, his cousin Theodore Roosevelt had stated in a speech as president that he was going to give the American people a square deal by taking on the ruthless, successful industrialists or robber barons of Gilded Age America, as well as reducing inequality in the country. Now, Roosevelt sought to deliberately echo his cousin 30 years later, when he declared at the start of his own presidency that the American people would have a New Deal, through which the federal government would pull them out of the Great Depression and back to work and prosperity. During his tenure as state governor of New York, Roosevelt gave regular radio broadcasts direct into people's homes that he named his fireside chats, in which he would lay out his plans for governance or address other issues. After becoming president, Franklin continued these broadcasts on a national scale, informing the population of what he planned to do to address the economic turmoil. These fireside chats took advantage of the dominant form of media in the country at the time, the radio. Though it may seem retrograde today, Roosevelt was being entirely modern in his day to turn to the radio to reach out to millions of Americans and galvanize public sentiment around his administration's new policies. Almost immediately upon assuming his role as president, Roosevelt sought to address the paralysis that was gripping the banking system, when on the 9th of March 1933, he passed the Emergency Banking Act that gave him the power to control bank opening times and also enabled him to order the Federal Reserve Bank to issue currency so that cash withdrawals could recommence. Finally, here was the quantitative easing which Hoover's administration had failed to provide. This action had the desired effect, as 6 days later, on the 15th of March, the banks reopened, causing share prices to rise by 15% as a consequence, as public deposits and withdrawals resumed. This effectively ended the bank run. After this, Roosevelt then initiated his program of relief, recovery and reform as part of his strategy for ending the Great Depression, the New Deal. He started by setting up the Federal Emergency Relief Administration in May of 1933 that was established to provide assistance to state governments by means of loans as well as grants, so that they could relieve unemployment through public works programs. Later that year, he signed a repeal that brought an end to prohibition, largely in an effort to help stimulate the economy and increase tax revenue, along with people's morale. Shortly after signing the repeal, Franklin stated that he thought this would be a good time for a beer. These reforms were also augmented by the setting up of the Public Works Administration that would come to spend nearly $7 billion over the next decade, which is a massive figure in today's money, by initiating infrastructure projects throughout the country from roads to railways to dams and schools. Much of the infrastructure of the United States, which is still in use today, was built as a result of the New Deal of the mid-1930s. This glut of state investment was then further increased by the establishment of further agencies, including the Civilian Conservation Corporation, that got 250,000 young men back into work in more local rural projects, as well as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which helped industry with funding for railroads along with large infrastructure projects. On top of this, the Federal Trade Commission helped farmers and homeowners with mortgage relief, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act aimed to raise commodity prices by paying farmers to reduce their food production by leaving fields bare and cutting back on livestock. To ensure workers were better paid and fairly treated going forward, the President then brought in the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, which was enacted to regulate industry and ensure fair wages for workers, and also restrict production to keep prices at an even level. As well as all this, Roosevelt sought to cut federal spending by slashing military expenditure by over $700 million by restricting servicemen's pensions. However, after a campaign was instigated by veterans' lobby groups, Congress overruled him and paid out the pensions benefits in cash regardless. Yet, in the end, this gave the economy a further boost through consumer spending. From 1935 to 1936, the Roosevelt administration enacted the second part of its plans for relief and reform, that is known today as the Second New Deal, which, by and large, consisted of further public investment, but more importantly, focused on economic reform across various sectors. These included the 1935 Social Security Act that ensured the federal government was, from then on, bound by law to give aid to the elderly, the unemployed, and the disabled, as well as children in need. This was augmented with a kind of basic state healthcare provision to ensure the poor had a certain degree of medical care. There then came the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which was the largest public works program to date in U.S. history, and which funded the building of parks, schools, bridges, and roads in nearly every community across the country from 1935 onwards. The WPA employed nearly 9 million people, whose wages would then buy food and consumer goods, that in turn pumped money back into the economy, producing the knock-on effect of generating new jobs. Next came the National Labor Relations Act, that prevented the exploitation of workers by giving them fair working conditions as well as fair pay, and also ensured that industrial disputes and strikes did not occur through civil discourse between employers and employee unions. All of this had the effect of bringing an end to the Great Depression in the United States. Roosevelt's New Deal had proved enormously successful and avoided the species of extremist politics developing which had occurred in Germany, where the economic turmoil had led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in 1933. It is hard to understate the achievement of Roosevelt's administration in this. As one esteemed American historical biographer, Gene Edward Smith, noted of FDR in this respect, quote, "He lifted himself from a wheelchair to lift the nation from its knees." Although Roosevelt's New Deal did produce its desired effect in getting millions of Americans back into work, it was met with fierce resistance within certain quarters of the private sector as well as the Republican establishment, who were opposed to any kind of state intervention in the economy. There is still fierce debate today as to whether the centralized power of the Roosevelt administration was in keeping with America's capitalist principles, and some even claim his program of reforms and relief was socialist in its outlook. One of the most ardent critics of Roosevelt's policies during this period was his old political ally, Al Smith, who, as a conservative Democrat, was opposed to the president's interference in private industry. During the lead-up to the 1936 presidential election, Smith tried to portray Roosevelt as a communist in all but name, and even compared him to Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. But Smith's public criticism soon backfired in spectacular fashion, as Roosevelt's reforms had lifted millions of people out of poverty and meant that he now had the loyal support of the majority of the American public as well as the country's unions, who saw Al Smith and the business leaders opposed to the New Deal as the kind of people who had caused the economic upheaval in the first place. Roosevelt's presidency in the mid-1930s also steps towards a more congenial federal policy towards the country's huge African American population. Race relations in America had soured enormously in the aftermath of the First World War, with black neighborhoods in cities like Tulsa experiencing extreme violence, and the Ku Klux Klan re-emerging as a very significant force in American life. By the mid-1920s, the Klan had millions of members. By some reckonings, more than 1 in 10 white American males were members of it at this time, and lynchings of African Americans became a common feature of life in the American South in the 1920s. Roosevelt tried to redress this in the 1930s, tightening legislation which cracked down on vigilante attacks on African Americans. His New Deal policies inevitably gained him support from amongst black Americans, who were more likely to have lost their jobs as a result of the Great Depression. Perhaps most significantly, Eleanor Roosevelt emerged as a great champion of black Americans as First Lady during the 1930s and was sympathetic to organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. All of this ensured that African Americans began transferring their votes from the Republicans to the Democratic Party in the course of the 1930s, beginning a mass realignment of American politics. Eventually, Roosevelt would issue Executive Order 8802 in 1941, which created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, a measure which has been deemed by historians as the most important move in support of the rights of African Americans in the workplace between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Hoping to capitalize on his overwhelming approval ratings, Roosevelt sought re-election as president in 1936 and won an unprecedented victory by securing all but 2 states and claiming nearly 61% of the popular vote, which was the largest margin of victory since the uncontested presidential election of 1820. Roosevelt's acquisition of 98.49% of the Electoral College remains the highest margin of victory in a contested U.S. presidential election other than George Washington's 100% votes in 1788 and 1792. Roosevelt's second term was largely dominated by him struggling to overcome the resistance of the U.S. Supreme Court that had blocked or halted several of his New Deal reforms, and he then sought to end its opposition by proposing a bill to replace aging Supreme Court justices with his own supporters. This was subsequently blocked by a cross-party coalition, who feared that Roosevelt's bill would make both he and his successors too powerful. Indeed, one of the criticisms that could be leveled at Franklin Roosevelt is that he was too controlling in his administration, as he was notoriously devious and conniving in his dealings, and famously once said that he never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing. This control of the secrecy even extended to his last vice president and eventual successor, Harry Truman, who was kept in the dark about many of Roosevelt's plans during the Second World War, including the United States nuclear weapons program. One of the few people Franklin was unable to control in his life was his wife Eleanor, who consistently lobbied him throughout his presidency on matters that were close to her heart, such as help for the poor, as well as civil and women's rights, that she promoted during public appearances and radio broadcasts, and even held nearly 350 press conferences during her husband's tenure, and, more than any other figure, created the modern position of first spouse. Eleanor would also spend much of her time traveling the country, after which she would report back to her husband on the progress of his New Deal, and it is fair to say that her activism certainly aided her husband, who, after all, could not travel easily. After returning from her visits, she would brief the president at length on the situation across the country and what actions she felt were then required. This inevitably caused a great degree of friction between Franklin and Eleanor during his presidency, as he had to juggle myriad problems as well as his wife's causes, although on the whole they came to form a formidable political partnership that earned them both the respect and admiration of millions of Americans. By the late 1930s, there were growing concerns at the rise of Adolf Hitler's Germany in Europe. The Nazis were seeking to expand Germany's borders by annexing neighboring countries such as Austria and Czechoslovakia, that along with the aggressive expansion of the Japanese Empire in Manchuria and eastern China, was starting to threaten world peace. War, it seemed, was inevitable. The United States foreign policy had since the end of the First World War been isolationist in its outlook, because many people within the country did not want to interfere in any costly European wars, which was further complicated by large portions of the US population being descendants of European immigrants from countries like Germany and Italy. Roosevelt was a believer in Woodrow Wilson's outward-looking policies and was not an isolationist himself, but his hands were largely tied by Congress and public opinion. He was, for instance, prevented from interfering in the Spanish Civil War, which broke out in 1936, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in the early 1930s. The outlook began to change, however, when Hitler broke his Munich Agreement with Britain and France, which had been agreed in September 1938 and had allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia in 1938. The Germans, though, broke the terms of the Munich Agreement within months by invading the rest of Czechoslovakia on the 15th of March 1939. With this, Britain and France began rearming more speedily in preparation for the war which now seemed inevitable. In America, these events prompted Roosevelt to begin preparations for a possible war with the Axis powers over the coming months, as he recognized that America could no longer afford to maintain its isolationist stance, particularly as Japan evidently was bent on expansion of its own in the South Pacific, which could in time potentially threaten the United States colonies in the region, such as the Philippines. When Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, which prompted Roosevelt to align himself with the Western Allies. When France itself fell to Germany in the summer of 1940, isolationism in the United States went into steep decline, which garnered enough support to allow the president to sanction a massive increase in military spending, along with the country's first peacetime draft that would swell the ranks of the US Army to nearly 1.5 million men by 1941. Roosevelt also proved to be pragmatic in his choice of military advisors at this time, as he appointed Republican interventionists such as Henry Stimson and Frank Knox as his secretaries of war and the Navy respectively, both of whom were in favor of his support of Britain after the fall of France. Moreover, as both men were not Democrats, their promotions helped to win over many Republicans to the president's interventionist approach. The president then increased his support of Britain and its new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, with whom he had been in regular contact since the 1930s, by giving the Royal Navy 50 destroyer-class battleships from the First World War in return for access to naval bases across the Caribbean, which proved to be invaluable in strengthening ties between the two nations as well as the United Kingdom's naval defences. Roosevelt had before this sought to help the European allies by passing the Neutrality Act in November of 1939 that allowed the sale of US weapons in return for cash. However, this aid to Britain, Free France, China, and later the Soviet Union would subsequently be escalated into the $50 billion program of aid that is known today as Lend-Lease, which was passed into law in March of 1941 and allowed war materials and resources to be lent or leased to Allied nations under the pretext that doing so would aid US national security. It was traditional for US presidents to only serve 2 4-year periods in office, as the 2-term period was not yet enshrined within the US Constitution. This followed a precedent which George Washington had set in the late 1790s, when he refused to stand for a 3rd term, declaring that if a president were to stay in office for too long, America could devolve into dictatorship or monarchy. However, this was not enshrined in law. Rather, it was a political custom that presidents would not stand for a 3rd term, and which had been adhered to by all Washington's successors. Yet because the United States was clearly entering into another period of crisis, Roosevelt decided to break with tradition and campaign for re-election, a campaign which resulted in him winning an unprecedented 3rd term on the 5th of November 1940, In the election, he won nearly 55% of the popular vote and 38 of the then 48 states, Alaska and Hawaii not then being states. This election was timely to say the least, as less than a month later, Imperial Japan would force America into World War II by launching one of the most notorious and daring preemptive strikes in the history of warfare in an effort to secure domination of the Pacific Ocean. Although the head of the Japanese state was its Emperor Hirohito, the country's government had, since the devastation of the Great Depression, much like Germany, come under the control of militaristic nationalists who advocated the rejection of democracy along with Western liberal culture and sought to end Japan's dependence on foreign imports of raw materials by means of the creation of an Asian Pacific Empire. The first stage of this expansion took place in 1931, with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in what is now northeastern China, which was then followed 6 years later by its partial annexation of China in 1937, securing the major cities along the east coast of the country. This prompted the United States and Roosevelt to halt all exports of material from America that could aid the Japanese war effort, which included nearly 95% of Japan's oil supply. This essentially forced the Japanese to choose between halting their expansion or escalating it, the former of which was not an option. Therefore, plans were put in place for further invasions and attacks on territories and islands across Southeast Asia, as well as the Western Pacific, including British imperial outposts, along with US colonies in the Philippines. The Japanese now saw the nullification and subjugation of both Britain's Eastern Empire and America's Pacific colonies and naval bases as key to securing their supremacy over the region, and it was also decided that the United States Pacific Fleet based in Hawaii would have to be destroyed in order to ensure naval supremacy in the Far East. Plans were accordingly drawn up by the military planners in Tokyo in the late 1930s to bring this about. The likelihood of war was then increased by the appointment of Hideki Tojo as Prime Minister of Japan on the 17th of October 1941, who had long advocated a preemptive strike against the United States, and over the following months preparations were finalized with the Emperor's approval by the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, for a massive naval task force to attack the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, along with simultaneous invasions of British and American colonies and overseas stations in the Western Pacific. In the meantime, negotiations were attempted with the aim of preventing hostilities, but when the Americans demanded the full Japanese withdrawal from China in return for the re-establishment of trade, the decision was taken by the Japanese to initiate war with the United States. On the 26th of November 1941, a massive task force set sail from the Japanese home islands under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and headed east across the northern Pacific before turning south towards the Hawaiian archipelago. This fleet consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, which carried over 400 aircraft and were escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 23 submarines. These included midget submarines, which effectively were to be used on suicide missions. The Japanese then continued to approach Hawaii and finally attacked the islands on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, resulting in over a dozen US ships being sunk or badly damaged, including 8 battleships and over 2,000 servicemen and civilians being killed or injured. Crucially for the Americans, however, the prime targets of the Japanese, the aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were out of port at the time of the attack, which was of vital importance as these carriers would later form the nucleus of the United States Pacific Fleet that would come to decimate the Japanese Navy over the coming months and years. One day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt declared war on Imperial Japan, and the same day delivered a famous speech to a joint session of the US Congress, stating that, yesterday, December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. 3 days later, on the 11th of December 1941, Germany and Italy joined with their Japanese allies and declared war on the United States. This, in effect, sealed their doom, as the world's richest and most powerful industrial nation had now joined the conflict with which the Axis powers could not hope to compete. Roosevelt and his generals were determined that there would be a quick retaliatory strike against Japan in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This need not be a massive campaign or initiative, but rather a symbolic action, one which would buoy morale at home in the US. On the 21st of December, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the White House, during the course of which meeting it was determined that an aerial raid would be conducted against targets in Japan itself. The planning and leading of the mission was entrusted to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. Over the next few months, Doolittle, who was in regular contact with Roosevelt during the planning process, organized an aerial raid whereby American bomber planes would take off from an aircraft carrier in the Pacific Ocean and strike at targets in Japan itself. What has gone down in US military law as the Doolittle Raid was finally undertaken on the 18th of April 1942. During it, 16 US B-25 Mitchell medium bombers flew over Japan, dropping bombs on Tokyo and other key cities and sites. They then carried on westwards, with most of the planes crash landing over China, where the US airmen made contact with their allies amongst the Chinese nationalists and communists, though several airmen were captured by the Japanese. The Doolittle Raid caused minimal damage to Tokyo and the other sites which were bombed, but the psychological impact on US morale at home when news of the raid was released is considered to have been immense in the early stages of US involvement in the war. The overwhelming industrial, economic and military might of the Allied alliance did not take long to manifest itself, as little more than 6 months after Pearl Harbor in June of 1942, the United States Navy, along with the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, engaged and defeated the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway in the South Pacific, in which all 4 of the fleet's Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, meaning that the country's offensive capability in the Pacific theater was effectively ended in one fell swoop. The Japanese were from this point onwards forced onto the defensive across the Pacific, and the Americans then started their operations against the European Axis powers, when they landed in North Africa in late 1942, culminating in over 300,000 Axis troops surrendering in Tunisia 6 months later. This came only a few months after Hitler had lost a further 500,000 troops killed or captured in the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. While the generals and Joint Chiefs of Staff oversaw most of the military planning for the war, Roosevelt was heavily involved. There is no better indication of this than his role in a battle which became the turning point of the war in the Pacific against Japan. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had spent the first 6 months of 1942 expanding very aggressively across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. In the early summer, they occupied the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. On one of the principal islands here, Guadalcanal, they quickly began building an airfield at Henderson's Field, with the goal of using it as a launching pad for a more intense bombing campaign against Australia and a possible invasion. The US government was determined to prevent this, and so in early August 1942, it initiated an amphibious invasion of Guadalcanal, one of America's first major counterattacks against the Japanese after the triumph at Midway. Although the initial landing of over 10,000 Marines caught the Japanese by surprise and resulted in the capture of Henderson's Field, they quickly regrouped and counterattacked. New troops were shipped in by the Japanese, and as a result the fighting on Guadalcanal would descend into a long campaign of attrition in the jungle terrain on the Pacific Island. It would last 6 months. Roosevelt was central to the Guadalcanal campaign from its inception. He was anxious even before it was launched that, despite the policy of tackling the Germans first in Europe, that the Japanese were not given a free hand in the Pacific. Once it began and did not result in a swift victory, he consistently reaffirmed his commitment to taking Guadalcanal. Following the Japanese counterattack in the early autumn, he sent the Chiefs of Staff a message stating, quote, "My anxiety about the Southwest Pacific is to make sure that every possible weapon gets into that area to hold Guadalcanal. he subsequently ordered the dispatch of 20 more ships to the island carrying more troops and supplies. This was vital, as the Japanese launched a massive assault on the US position on the island in mid-November 1942, and had FDR not reinforced their position weeks earlier, the Guadalcanal campaign probably would have ended in Japanese victory at that point. By January, though, by which time Roosevelt's government had committed over 60,000 men to the Guadalcanal campaign, as well as scores of battleships and transports and over 1,000 aircraft, the Japanese began their withdrawal from the island, realizing Guadalcanal was lost. It was a brutal conflict, the hazardous conditions of the tropical island being such that veterans of the campaign later claimed it was the Stalingrad of the Pacific Front. But Roosevelt's resolve had won out, and the tide of war in the Pacific turned considerably following Guadalcanal. The main reasons for these Allied victories were not simply their advantages in sheer manpower, but they also lay in a colossal industrial capability the United States possessed. Between 1941 and the end of the war in 1945, for example, the Americans produced nearly 2.5 million trucks, 90,000 tanks, and in 1944 alone, produced more aircraft than Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union combined. The entire US economy was repurposed to achieve this. This industrial might, combined with America's plentiful natural resources, were, along with the massive manpower deployed by the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front in Europe, the key to the American and Allied victory during the Second World War, as both Germany and Japan's natural resources were vastly smaller by comparison, and their industrial capacity was a fraction of the United States. Once this economic might was brought to bear, the tide of the war began to turn. Although Roosevelt agreed that the war against Hitler's Germany was to be given priority over Japan, the Americans were still able, after the Battle of Midway, to steadily retake all of the Japanese conquests in the South Pacific in a succession of hard-fought amphibious assaults over the coming years. By 1945, Japan was cut off, surrounded, and starving. There were, of course, some black spots in America's wartime record which Roosevelt must shoulder some of the blame for as the nation's president. In a conflict as bloody and compromising as the Second World War, it is inevitable that even those nations which were on the right side of history got some things wrong. A notable issue when it comes to America was its approach to the Japanese-American community within the United States following the outbreak of war with the Empire of Japan. There were approximately 127,000 Japanese Americans living in the continental United States at that time, the majority of whom lived on the West Coast, largely in California. Of these, 2/3 had been born in America and considered the United States to be their home. However, Roosevelt's administration and Congress as a whole took the position early in 1942 that these Japanese Americans were a potential fifth column of the Japanese state within America, who might seek to undermine America from within. Accordingly, in the first weeks of 1942, Roosevelt signed a series of presidential orders which effectively allowed for the mass incarceration of anyone with Japanese ancestry in America. During the course of the war, over 110,000 Japanese Americans were subsequently detained in concentration camps established in various parts of the country. This policy was overwhelmingly approved of by the US people during the war, but it has since been criticized on the grounds that those who were detained had no links to the Japanese government. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which issued a formal apology on behalf of the US government to those who had been detained, and over the next 5 years, over $1.5 billion in reparations were paid to those who had been incarcerated and their families. Similarly, the Roosevelt government had been criticized for its approach to the Holocaust of Europe's Jews, which eventually resulted in the deaths of 6 million people. The argument has been that the country could have done more to take in Jews who were fleeing the Nazi persecutory policies from 1933 onwards. Yet, even as it was, the US took in somewhere between 180,000 and 225,000 Jewish refugees between the first rise to power of the Nazis in 1933 and the end of the Second World War in 1945. Moreover, once the scale of what might be occurring in Central and Eastern Europe became apparent, Roosevelt's administration established the War Refugee Board in 1944, with the goal of organizing efforts to rescue and provide relief for Jews fleeing Europe. This eventually saved the lives of thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of European Jews in the final year of the war. Consequently, Roosevelt's administration cannot be too harshly criticized for its response to the Holocaust. The US government did what it could and responded to an evolving situation. Lawmakers in the 1930s cannot be condemned for not predicting what the Nazis would do in the 1940s. In the lead-up to the opening of a second front in Europe, President Roosevelt had advocated that any Allied invasion should take place via northern France, whereas Winston Churchill, in contrast, argued that any invasion should be conducted through the Italian peninsula, stating that the country was Hitler's soft underbelly. However, the Italian theatre, in reality, turned out to be Hitler's tough old gut, as the country's hilly terrain naturally favoured a defensive campaign. Therefore, the American assertion that the major Allied invasion should be conducted through France can, in hindsight, be said to have been the correct course of action. When it was initiated, it resulted in a relatively speedy advance through Normandy after the D-Day landings in the early summer of 1944, ensuring that Western Germany was not overrun by the Soviets after Germany's collapse. Despite Roosevelt's disability, it soon became evident during late 1942 that a conference was needed between the leaders of the Allied powers in order to better coordinate the war effort. However, since the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin refused to travel far from Moscow, the decision was taken for both Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt to meet at the Iranian capital of Tehran in late November of 1943. This involved Roosevelt having to travel over 7,000 miles from America to the Middle East, which took a massive toll on his health. At the conference, he sought to appease Stalin by distancing himself from Winston Churchill over the future of Eastern Europe, as he did not want Stalin to think that the Americans and British were acting as a unified force. This involved Roosevelt refusing to partake in discussions regarding the post-war status of Poland, as he felt there were more pressing concerns, and seeing as the Soviets were inevitably going to occupy the country over the coming months anyway, Roosevelt calculated that it was more important to appease the Soviet dictator rather than alienate him. This cordial approach towards Stalin is further illustrated by Roosevelt's response to the Soviet leader's demand that 50,000 German officers should be shot after the war, to which the president jokingly replied that, quote, "Maybe 49,000 would be enough." This was met with outrage and disbelief from the British Prime Minister. In the end, Churchill's approach towards Stalin would prove to be correct, as Eastern Europe was subjected to nearly half a century of Soviet occupation after the Second World War. Therefore, it could be perhaps argued that Roosevelt's overly accommodating attitude towards the Soviet Union was misguided, though it should also be borne in mind that Roosevelt was anxious to keep the Russians on side for the Pacific campaign against the Japanese, which was to follow after victory in Europe was attained. However, the Tehran Conference and the 14,000-mile round trip that it entailed had a devastating effect on Roosevelt's health, as he had been under massive stress for over a decade by this time, which was no doubt due to the fact that during his presidency, America had been in an almost constant state of crisis. A chain smoker, Roosevelt had also enjoyed a daily diet of fine food and cocktails for many years, but as he was unable to undertake regular exercise, it soon became apparent that his lifestyle and workload was taking its toll, which would later be further exacerbated by him embarking on an even longer journey to meet with Stalin and Churchill in the Crimean city of Yalta in February of 1945. As a result of his visible deterioration, Roosevelt, who was still just in his early 60s, underwent tests at Bethesda Hospital, Maryland in March of 1944 and was found, to the great alarm of his attending doctor, to have incredibly high blood pressure. At one point, this hit 240 over 130. He was also found to be suffering from coronary artery disease and heart failure, effectively meaning his time was short. In an effort to avert imminent disaster, Roosevelt undertook a period of rest and recuperation over the coming months, in which he cut down his smoking to a dozen cigarettes a day, as well as a single cocktail in the evenings after meals. During this period, he also spent some weeks fishing with friends, and after returning to the White House, he only worked for 4 hours per day. Another source of comfort for Franklin during this time was the rekindling of his relationship with his former flame Lucy Mercer, who had married after the breakup of her affair with Franklin nearly 20 years before. She was now widowed, and their reunion was instigated by Roosevelt's daughter Anna, who organized for them to see one another once again behind her mother's back. This was perhaps because Eleanor and Franklin were not close as a husband and wife by this stage, as they acted more like close friends or political allies rather than a couple. Therefore, Anna sought to alleviate her father's stress, as well as his loneliness, by helping him to see Lucy once again. However, later after his death, Eleanor discovered that Franklin had been seeing Lucy with her daughter's help, resulting in them not speaking to one another for some time. Despite the ongoing war, Roosevelt was also anxious to leave a lasting legacy on U.S. domestic policy, even as his health declined precipitously. On the 11th of January 1944, he delivered his 11th State of the Union speech, the annual address given to a joint session of Congress by the President following a precedent which George Washington had set in the 1790s, and which had been revived by Roosevelt's mentor years earlier, Woodrow Wilson. In his 11th address, Roosevelt spoke about the fashioning of a second Bill of Rights for America, one which would add new economic provisions to what the Founding Fathers had established in the 1770s and 1780s. In Roosevelt's view, it was necessary to ensure that Americans had a right to employment, decent housing, an adequate income, education, and health care. He stressed in his speech that it was not simply the moral thing for a nation to provide these basic rights to its citizens, but that if wars of the kind which America was now engaged in fighting were to be avoided in the future, all developed nations would need to create a social net in order for its citizens to avoid social unrest. The same conclusion had been reached by William Beveridge, a British academic who, in 1942, had produced a report on what shape post-war Britain should take, and this may have influenced Roosevelt. Roosevelt's proposed Second Bill of Rights would become the informal framework of the Democratic Party in the post-war period. It was hugely popular, and with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, the Democrats would dominate the presidency down to the end of the 1960s, largely running on Roosevelt's policy framework. Thus, Roosevelt, in many ways, shaped the Democratic Party long after his own time. It was evident by late 1944 that the Allies were going to be victorious on all fronts in the Second World War, and despite being advised not to by those close to him due to his ill health, Roosevelt decided to campaign for a fourth term as president in November of 1944. He emerged victorious once again by claiming over 53% of the popular vote and winning 36 of the 48 states, making him by far the longest-serving president in American history. By this time, the possibility of a swift victory over the Japanese had also presented itself. In early 1939, top scientists such as Albert Einstein had written to Roosevelt warning him of Germany's possible nuclear weapons program, and shortly afterwards the United States initiated the Manhattan Project with the help of many German Jewish scientists who had fled the country during the 1930s. This program eventually bore fruit on the 16th of July 1945, when the first nuclear weapon, codenamed Trinity, was successfully detonated in New Mexico. By this time, Germany had been defeated in Europe, but the Allies were preparing for a long, bloody assault on the Japanese archipelago, which some analysts predicted could result in the loss of 1.5 million troops. Thus, in order to avoid this, the United States dropped 2 atom bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, prompting Emperor Hirohito to announce his country's surrender on the 15th of August. This weapon, more than anything, made the United States the world's most powerful country after 1945, and until the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapons in 1949, the country was practically invulnerable as a nation, as it now had along with the atom bomb, the largest navy, air force, and economy the world had ever seen. Indeed, some US generals, such as General George Patton, were adamant that the US should continue its war effort and attack the Soviet Union. Such was the strategic advantage it enjoyed in 1945. One of Franklin Roosevelt's lasting legacies was his resurrection of the League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations, the formation of which had been first agreed between the President and Winston Churchill as early as 1941, and which was finally brought into being in San Francisco on the 25th of April 1945, at which the UN Charter was drafted, which bound all the participating nations to certain standards of human rights, as well as to the preservation of peace for future generations. Over the coming years, Eleanor Roosevelt would also play a key role in the founding of the United Nations, when she was invited by her husband's successor, President Truman, to become a delegate to the General Assembly after 1945, where she also chaired the committee that came to pass the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. She would continue to take an active role in politics and humanitarian issues until her own death in 1962. The United Nations was in many ways the zenith of President Roosevelt's political career, during which he had brought America out of the Great Depression, overseen its victory in the Second World War, and in the United Nations formed an international body whose aim was to prevent a recurrence of the massive bloodshed and suffering that had plagued mankind in the first half of the 20th century. However, Roosevelt would never live to see the world he did so much to form, as on the 12th of April 1945, while sitting having his portrait painted at his retreat, the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, the president complained of a terrible headache and soon afterwards lost consciousness and slumped forward in his chair. He was then rushed to his bedroom, where he was diagnosed as having suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. A few hours later, at 3:35 p.m., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, aged just 63. It is no exaggeration to say that many Americans were left in despair at the president's passing, as to millions of people he was a savior who had not only delivered the country from the greatest economic downturn of the 20th century, but had also crushed Imperial Japan as well as Nazi Germany in the largest and most destructive war the world had yet seen. A day after his passing, the president's coffin, draped in the Star-Spangled Banner, was taken to Washington, D.C. and progressed through the streets of the capital, lined with thousands of mourners, before being taken by train to his birthplace at Hyde Park, where he was laid to rest in the rose garden of his Springwood estate, where he, along with his wife Eleanor, remain to this very day. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is today considered by many American historians to be one of, if not the greatest president in the history of the United States of America, generally deemed to be on the same level as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Although he certainly enjoyed a privileged upbringing in his early years of life, there is no doubt that he possessed immense reserves of strength and bravery to overcome the paralyzing disease that is polio. For him, to then go on to become president, let alone one of the greatest presidents in US history, is nothing short of extraordinary, and stands as a testament to his strength of character as well as his intelligence and ability. Many critics of Roosevelt's New Deal have, since his death, claimed that his programs of relief and reform were far too liberal or even socialist in their outlook, as they increased the size and power of the federal US state, which in some people's eyes is at odds with the founding principles of the US Constitution. His defenders would argue, however, that his reforms were simply necessary measures in a time of crisis that lifted millions of people out of unemployment as well as abject poverty, and set the United States firmly on course for a period of prosperity and wealth that was hitherto unparalleled in human history. Indeed, the period between the 1930s and the 1960s saw more Americans join the middle classes than any other period in US history, in considerable part owing to the legacy of the New Deal. What virtually all people can agree on is that Franklin Roosevelt successfully guided America through the greatest war in human history, from which it emerged as the world's most powerful country. Therefore, it is difficult to argue against the assertion that America was stronger as a nation, both internally and externally, after his presidency than it was before it. What is also certain is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is one of the most important figures of the entire 20th century, as his presidency shaped the geopolitical landscape of the entire world for decades after his death, and in many ways his life and career formed the world we all of us live in today. What do you think of Franklin D. Roosevelt? Was his New Deal a socialist program that increased the power of the American state? Or was he a hero who, despite not being able to stand himself, lifted the American people from their knees and set the United States on a course to greatness? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.